In just 2 days of Trump's visit, the amount of trade between the two sides has reached $253.5 billion US, creating a record for Sino-US economic and trade cooperation. What's behind this historic movement? Trump's entourage includes 29 American business representatives covering energy, industry, financial services and agriculture, with the majority related to energy. What are the implications behind this? The deficit has always been a top issue on Trump's agenda and is something the two countries cannot deal with quickly or easily. Will President Xi make concessions on the deficit issue? China has been trying to bring the DPRK and the US to the table, but Trump trading insults with Kim Jong-un has continued to fuel tensions. Can the personal connection between Trump and Xi help the two countries to better agree on an approach to de-escalation?
President Trump's first state visit to China started big with a State Visit Plus welcome at the Forbidden City in Beijing. Cooperation and competition have become the watchwords for the current China-US relationship. But how much of each can we expect on the economic front as a result of this trip? What's the future for the further development of China-US trade? And what are the main obstacles facing both sides? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the Beijing studio by Paul Hanley, Director of the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy, and Dr. Jia Daojun, Professor of International Political Economy at Peking University. We shall also talk with Professor Dennis Wilder from the School of Foreign Policy, Foreign Service at Georgetown University via satellite. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Now, gentlemen, whatever the disputes in our bilateral relationship, I wonder if we can build a consensus, at least in this Beijing studio at this moment. Today, we, Chinese and foreign media alike, witnessed the defining moment of the bilateral relationship. However, some Americans would only talk about the pomp and the style of the trip to Forbidden City, whilst the Chinese say, hey, look at the substance of the trip. Today, as we heard in the opening background story, both sides signed so many contracts, hefty contracts worth of billions of US dollars. Up to $200 billion US were signed. So what do you think of the deliverables coming out of this trip? Paul, we start with your analysis.
Well, first, thank you for having me on your show, Yang Rui. I always enjoy an opportunity to be on Dialogue. I thought the atmosphere around the trip was particularly warm. The Chinese putting forward the State Visit Plus, indicating that it really wants to roll the red carpet out for President Trump and give him the accord and respect that believe is warranted. You also mentioned there's been $250 billion worth of deals reached. I was at the reception last night with Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross and the 29 CEOs, and I think they were all quite pleased at the deals that were reached. And those are all, I think, positives. My concern, to be honest, is the structural economic and trade issues that are on the agenda that President Trump talked about today, because I think those actually are at the heart of the concerns expressed by President Trump and the U.S. administration and friends in Europe and others in the region about the need to rebalance the trade and economic relationship with China. And I have not heard yet what has come out of this visit, but President Trump did talk about barriers to market access. He talked about forced technology transfer, IPR, and industrial policies. And those are all issues that I think will require working together to find ways to make progress on those. Otherwise, I worry that the tone in the United States toward China could sour, even despite this successful visit in all the ways that you mentioned.
What do you think of the structural problems that both sides are facing?
Well, the definition of structural problems can be different from each side, although the differences are beginning to narrow. The Foreign Ministry of China followed the announcement of a $250 billion trade and investment deal by saying China is going to further open at its own pace, but nevertheless further open its banking sector, insurance, and other financial services. And earlier you mentioned a good point. Europe, Japan, and other economic partners. China is a big member of the WTO. Whatever we promise to the United States ought to be applicable to other major economies as well. This cannot be and should not be a U.S. exclusive. Now, with regard to intellectual property, most of the assessments say probably the area where the Chinese economy made some progress in the past was probably in that area, although these things are never-ending pursuit. But with the issue area where U.S. and China does differ and will continue is probably over industrial policy. This is not new. The U.S. has similar disputes not only with China today. It had similar dispute with Japan back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and today, you know. The nature of Made in China 2025 is about the same as industrialization 4.0 in Germany. Maybe I'm not so sure about the German name for that. So in other words, government-directed efforts at industrialization, and it does bring a lot of competitive issues, and sometimes with dual-use implications, such as artificial intelligence. U.S. and China economic relations is very much like security relations. It's like the bottle, we see this as half full or half empty. But we need both to have the entire bottle there. That's how I see it.
Yeah, that's a very philosophical understanding about the competitive and cooperative relationship between the two major economies. Let me go to Professor Dennis Wilder for his thoughts on the major concerns he might share with us today about the U.S.-China business exchange. Hi, Dennis, what can you tell us?
Well, good evening. It's great to be on your show. You know, from sitting here in Washington and watching the summit, I guess I would call this the summit of mutual admiration and respect. Both leaders tried very hard, I think, to demonstrate in public how much they respected each other, and I think that's a great thing. On the economic side, let me get specific. I agree very much with Paul Hanley about some of the U.S. concerns. I was just in Beijing this week, and when I tried to use my Visa card in many places in Beijing, I can't. That's a problem. And that was supposed to be solved earlier this year, and yet clearly that problem is not being solved yet. That's just one specific example of market access that really upsets Americans, frankly.
Right. Americans tend to be very specific about the challenges. Just go ahead, Dennis. Go ahead.
So I think that what we are going to see going forward is that the Trump administration, as it's doing, frankly, with Japan and with Korea, is asking for a better deal. It's saying China is now the world's second largest economy. We need the deal to be more reciprocal than it has been. That in many ways in the past we cut China some slack because it was developing and we wanted to see China prosper. But now China's in a different place. China is a much more confident nation. China is a richer nation. And so I think the trading relationship has to change to some degree.
How do you respond to his concern on the
Visa card?
The Visa card, as well as the latest change of China's niche in the world economic relationship.
You know, I think to understand how many Americans see it, in 2001 when China joined the WTO, many saw this as the beginning of China's opening up. And I think 16, 17 years later, people have concluded that that was the beginning of China getting even more closed. One recent trade official from the U.S. administration said to me recently that if every economy in the world were to operate in the closed fashion that China does, the global economic and trading system would not work. And China relies, as you know, and has benefited from over these last several years, the open and free global economic and trading system. And so I think there is a huge appetite in the United States to try to recalibrate this relationship. You know, Dennis and I worked in the White House together in the Bush administration, and you know me, Yang Rui, I believe very much in a constructive U.S.-China relationship. I think this relationship is extremely important and consequential. And my fear coming out of this trip is that potentially we could have different conclusions as to the success of this trip. President Xi, I'm sure, and the senior leadership in China will say that President Xi really rolled out the red carpet for Donald Trump, gave him a lot of face, did a lot of things, an unprecedented tour and dinner at the Forbidden City.
That's what we call the State Visit Plus.
State Visit Plus, $250 billion worth of deals. I worry that President Trump goes home and is under pressure asking the question, what progress did you make on the structural issues that are causing the imbalances in the U.S.-China economic relationship? What progress have you made on North Korea? And if he and the administration don't have good answers, I think you could potentially see a hardening of U.S. policy towards China, even potential confrontation. And frankly, that worries me, and I don't want to see that.
I understand very well your concerns on the issue of trade protectionism. Our definition, as Professor Zhang may have mentioned earlier, is different about either the general picture or about what you call the closed state of the economy. President Xi Jinping promised over and over will support further opening up of the economy and the idea of globalization, which is questioned by President Trump and his team. So what do you think of our alleged protectionism?
Well, there are serious issues in the what we consider to be how to make the world economic structure work. For many here in China, they would point to the WTO looking at the so-called market economy status issue. Most recently, the U.S. Commerce Department came up with a 400-page document saying that China is not a market economy. Now, if you go back to the accession agreement that was signed back some 16 years back, this issue was going to be resolved. And many here in China would be probably giving a lot of pressure to our own leadership and saying, now, wait a minute, these major economies are not living up to their part of the bargain, and so why should we be making unilateral concessions? So you have a similar set of sentiments on the Chinese side, justified or not, that's up for debate. And out of that kind of background of each side digging in by saying, I need a reciprocal relationship, and then the next question is, who is going to make the first step? Or in a little bit of a journalistic language, who is going to blink first? I would rather see this, let's say, between the U.S. and China, we are indeed at a structural point. But it's not a point of no return. What we need to do, the next point on, is to see to the implementation of as many of the deals that are announced today and some re-announced today as solidly as possible. And then I keep coming to a different kind of point, that is to say, in terms of momentum, both China and the U.S. are not quite seeing with each other eye to eye on the necessity to take a leadership role and move forward with the WTO. And on regional trade arrangements, President Trump and President Xi will both be at the APEC meeting in Hanoi, in Da Nang in a few days. And there was a TPP, which was not including China. There is also an RCEP, Regional Economic Partnership, that did not include the U.S. And China and the United States are somehow missing the beat a bit, both, I should say, in terms of the APEC process. We should be working on that. It may be hard because there are so many others. They may not be on board automatically. Back when we had APEC here in Beijing, 2 years ago, there was this idea of a free trade area for the Asia Pacific. So in other words, there is also pressure on the China side of saying, did the WTO work for us? Why, when we look around the world, there are countries, economies that are way more closed, but that are treated as a market economy? Why are we, having made efforts to liberalize step by step, or in politically correct language at our own pace, still characterized as non-market economy? We need to have the conversation to go beyond it. I really think it's high time that we build on the momentum that's generated out of this positive trip, and if China and the U.S. can turn around to say, let's together lead feasibility study of a new form of regional trade arrangement for the entire Asia Pacific.
It is indeed, it's been indeed a chronic issue, chronic concern from both sides to help improve the structural problems concerning trade deficit, which is of course quite in favor of China. Now, having said this, let me go to Dennis. To accuse China of closing the door sounds pretty unfair, because look at the issue of, or sensitive issue of high-tech transfer, merger and acquisition by Chinese players of your high-tech firms. We've been always barred by lawmakers and by the White House. You always use the excuse of national security. Huawei has been one of the first casualties in this particular area, whilst on the Chinese side, we have agreed to open further areas for financial services and insurance, for example. This time around, big contracts were signed by both sides to further open China's door. What do you think of the proactive efforts by both sides? I mean, it seems that there has been a lackluster performance on the U.S. side to open up areas for products or services that might be of dual use, so to speak.
Well, Young Ray, I'm afraid I do have a bit of a different perspective on this. When my colleague in Beijing asked the question, what has China gotten out of the WTO, I think any economic observer of this situation would say China got a huge amount out of joining the WTO. Markets all around the world open to Chinese goods. China exports billions of dollars of goods a day to the U.S. economy. China has done extremely well off the WTO accession. The reason that market economy status is not being provided to China yet is, frankly, China has stalled on some of the economic reforms that it has promised. The third plenum of the 18th Party Congress said that the Chinese economy was moving in the direction of using market forces as the decisive factor. We have not seen those activities since that third plenum. And we and many of the American companies, many of the European companies are eager to see those things. I applaud China if indeed the financial services sector is going to be opened up. I think that's a great thing. But when you ask me why Chinese companies are barred in some areas, obviously there are national security concerns, as there are on the Chinese side. We are barred from some areas of the Chinese economy because of national security concerns, and we understand that. The Chinese companies, however, are putting a great deal of money into the U.S. economy now. Foreign direct investment from China has boomed in the last 2 years. That would suggest that there are plenty of opportunities for purchases in the United States by Chinese corporations. A Chinese corporation owns the second largest movie theater chain in the United States. Well, an American company could never buy a movie chain in China. We are barred from those areas of the economy. So I think we're looking for more reciprocity in this relationship.
Let me raise one example, Dennis. Kenneth Bridge, a company that is said to have a Chinese background in the United States, offered to acquire your lattice. That was barred. So Canyon Bridge ended up turning to Britain, where it successfully acquired Imagination, yet another very big and successful partner with Apple. Apple decided not to use its software, and therefore it gave China the opportunity for the merger and acquisition. So what do you think of the very different, entirely different interactions from the UK and the United States towards the proactive effort by Canyon Bridge to do such sort of investment?
The British have to make their own decisions on what are national security concerns and what are not national security concerns. The United States has to do what it feels is in its interest. China is protecting national champions of its own. There are telecommunications industry areas where we cannot, our companies cannot come into China because of national security concerns and the desire to have those areas blocked off. I don't think, frankly, this is the issue that a lot of Chinese make it seem. Very, very few deals go before the CFIUS
The follow-up question, Paul, is
exactly.
Because of the location, geopolitical rivalry between the United States and China, more hefty deals could be blocked in the future. Huawei wanted to do the same merger and acquisition in the United States, but he was blocked. He was given a warm welcome by former Prime Minister David Cameron in number 10 of Downing Street, in sharp contrast with the United States. Dao Jun, what do you want to say?
Well, I thought CFIUS, the American mechanism for reviewing foreign direct investment, including that from China, I don't really see it as a negative instrument. Every country has national security. We have our own systems for reviewing foreign direct investment into China. We just have to accept that in some industries, some technologies, the disputes will be continuing. But what really is required for both sides is what's promised after hard negotiations get delivered. If we go back a little bit to Danny's point about Visa card or MasterCard not being able to work in China, but then I believe the agreement was signed about a year or 2 years ago, or re-announced. So these things need to be worked out to build up goodwill. But at the same time, the Chinese banks have their own payment system, like Union Pay, that should be allowed to function in the United States. And reciprocity can be a principle. Reciprocity can be a promise. But reciprocity can also come from a build-up, a pile-up of efforts. And frankly speaking, you know, more and more Chinese now use the mobile phones, Tencent-based, for electronic payments. And that's being accepted throughout Asia. Why not some in the United States? So the strategic rivalry or not, each country, government and society would support those cutting-edge technologies. That's the given. And you have to work your way out. But then let's not forget that to honor the promises that were made. I think
we haven't been able to discuss the 100-day action that was first delivered at the Mar-a-Lago summit in Florida last year. Both sides are obviously focusing on the formulation of a one-year plan to further advance the bilateral trade and investment. Now, what do you think of the DPRK, which is, of course, prioritized for...
Move from one tough issue to another.
Exactly, because I know this is your stuff. You want to talk more about geopolitical concerns, particularly whether there will be a solution. Both sides said there will be a solution if we exercise our imagination and if we show our sincerity. What do you think?
Well, I'm not sure what progress is going to be made on this trip. I think these discussions on North Korea, for obvious reasons, will not be done between the two presidents in public. But I will tell you one thing that I observe by living in China, and that is that the frustration level from China towards North Korea is as high as I've ever seen it. Now, the United States, the Trump administration, is frustrated because that has not yet resulted in a more fundamental shift where China aligns closer to the United States and puts the kind of pressure on North Korea that the U.S. thinks is necessary to get Kim Jong-un to change his political calculus and give up and abandon his nuclear weapon program. But I wonder, and I've talked to many Chinese experts over the past few months, are we getting close to a Chinese red line? I heard recently that the North Koreans sent in an assassination team to assassinate the nephew of Kim Jong-un, the son of Kim Jong-nam, who was killed in Malaysia by North Korean agents. I understand that the anger of the senior leadership in China is pretty high. And I think that it's possible what we might see on this trip with President Trump is some reaction by China towards North Korea for that assassination attempt that then is also put in the context of President Trump's visit and will be in the form of some sort of incremental pressure. Whether or not it's enough to get the North Korean leader to change his political calculus, I'm somewhat skeptical about. This guy, this leader in North Korea, you could say is on the 1-yard line, getting ready to punch the ball into the end zone. And he will soon have a nuclear capability that can hold countries in the region quite vulnerable, including potentially soon the United States. And that's a game changer.
For us to be sitting here in China, including here in Beijing, the most tangible threat of a North Korean nuclear program is actually a nuclear accident. Somehow, whether through human error or whatever accident, then you get the contamination. We will be the first to suffer, and it's more than just the human price to pay on part of individuals. There are already reports of some technical failures in the North Korean territory. It's also, frankly speaking, a test of faith in our government's capacity to protect our own people. This is a very serious matter, make no mistake about it. But after all these many years, and including the more recent years, we don't quite see should we say, we are opposed to, but nevertheless we don't have that kind of switch button behind the North Korean behavior. It's not very sensible at all for the North Korean leadership to constantly thumb the nose at the United States or anybody else or be so personalized. We don't agree with that. But a desirable direction of action would be for China and the United States to together talk with North Korea, rather than just China and the United States talking about North Korea. So that's going to be a desirable action down the road.
With the war clouds gathering in Northeast Asia, Dennis, what do you think of the preconditions that the Trump administration attaches to the use of the military means? Because that will be eventually, ultimately, the major concern shared by all players in the region.
Well, I want to put an optimistic tone to this issue, which is often talked about endlessly as a land of lousy policy options. I think that the Chinese government and the United States government have come closer together on the North Korean issue. I think the latest UN sanctions are exactly what's necessary, and I think China is following through on those sanctions. I saw an interesting report, I don't know if it's confirmed, that China has made the decision to stop the flow of tourists into North Korea. I would agree that is a good move. I think the policy of maximum pressure, which really needs China's help, is the right way to go.
Okay, thank you so much, Dennis. Thank you, Professor Dennis. Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Dao Jun, for joining us. Well, this is actually a very interesting, controversial topic about the most consequential bilateral relationship in the world. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.